So we've all been in the boat before with a bunch of buddies when somebody just starts lighting them up, and more often than not, once you start digging in and trying to figure out why that's the case, it's often because their presentation is a little bit different. You know, whether they're working the bait a little bit more slowly or a little bit more quickly, or they're dragging it on the bottom, hopping it, or they're just using a bait that happens to be a little bit different than everybody else. So maybe they're using an 1/8 ounce jig versus a 1/4 ounce jig. Maybe they have a straight tail and everybody else is using a paddle tail, or minnows, or whatever it is, or maybe they're using hair. I love hair, but regardless, oftentimes you'll find out when someone's catching way more fish than everybody else, it's because their presentation is a little bit different. You see that all the time in the tournament world, where the guy who wins the tournament is doing something a little bit different than everybody else, so he's able to catch a few more fish, a few bigger fish. But regardless, today in this video we're gonna be doing something a little bit different. We're gonna be digging in to some of the minute details of fishing jigs for walleyes. We're gonna be throwing some of these different baits in the tank, and we're gonna compare drop speed, and we're gonna look at a bunch of different factors, whether you're using plastics, you're using minnows. We're gonna look at some of the fine details of jig fishing for walleyes. Now, first things first, we're gonna start off with the classic jig and minnow. Here's a quick comparison of the drop speed of an 1/8 ounce jig with a minnow and a 1/4 ounce jig with a minnow. All right, now honestly that was a little bit surprising. So like I said before, we dropped a 1/4 ounce fireball jig and an 1/8 ounce fireball jig with a minnow straight down right next to each other, and the drop speed, the fall rate, was almost exactly the same, interestingly. Now, albeit, of course, that wasn't that big of a difference to compare, but I had it in slow motion and you could see they were going down right next to each other the entire time. So that's sort of an interesting observation, but just out of curiosity, let's do something similar. Let's take a 1/4 ounce jig and an 1/8 ounce jig, and let's put a paddle tail minnow on the back of it. Okay, so that's a lot more of a difference. Let's try the same thing with an impulse smelt minnow. All right, so the results have been pretty interesting so far. When most people think about drop speed, they're often thinking primarily about the weight of the jig they're fishing. So you might have a 1/4 ounce and you would assume that that's gonna fall way faster than an 1/8 ounce. But what we're finding out right now, and what a lot of you probably already know, is that the weight of your jig is just a tiny part of the whole drop speed equation. So obviously, whatever you happen to have on the back of your bait is also gonna play a really huge part. So with that in mind, we're gonna move on to the next experiment. We're gonna take an 1/8 ounce deep V jig, and we're gonna put a number of different plastics on the back, or tippings on the back, I should say. We're gonna put an impulse smelt minnow, an impulse paddle minnow, and a rainbow shiner on the back of the 1/8 ounce deep V jig, and compare drop speeds. Now, as you can see, both the rainbow shiner and the impulse smelt minnow had an almost identical drop speed, while the paddle tail was a lot slower thanks to that big boot tail kicking in the back here. So that's an interesting observation. Now what we're gonna do is we're actually gonna upsize our deep V jig to the heavier 1/4 ounce and see how that impacts the drop speed of the plastics. So as you can see, the results were pretty darn similar. The smelt minnow had a lot faster drop speed than the paddle tail minnow with the kicking tail in the back, despite the fact that we upsized to the 1/4 ounce jig. So next up, we are gonna be talking about one of my absolute favorite categories of jigs, and that is hair jigs. Now, I'm a big fan of hair jigs for a few reasons. Number one is because they're really easy to fish, and you don't have to use meat on them, and you don't have to use plastics on them either. So obviously, when you're fishing for walleyes and catching a lot of fish, you're gonna be going through a bunch of plastics as you catch a bunch of fish. But what's great about this thing is that you can keep on casting it out there. Maybe if you had a fish come and bite the back of your bait and pull your pants down and have the plastic sticking all weird, you're not gonna have that problem when you're fishing hair jigs. So this one right here is the Northland Deep V bucktail jig, and we're gonna throw this one in the tank and compare it to the rest of the baits that we just have been showing you so far. Now, as you can see, the 1/8 ounce bucktail jig actually had a slightly faster drop speed than the jig and minnow, or even the jig and the impulse smelt minnow, which is pretty cool. And what's cool about this comparison as well is the fact that all of these baits have the exact same Deep V jig head in the 1/8 ounce size. So this is a really apples to apples comparison of drop speed. Now, I said earlier that one of the benefits of these hair jigs is the fact that you don't have to use a minnow, you don't have to use a plastic, but one thing that I love to do with these baits, honestly, is throw a plastic on it. And the reason for that is because it dramatically changes the drop speed. Check it out. That's pretty crazy, honestly. Now, we're gonna do the exact same comparison here, but we're gonna put the paddle tail on the back this time. And yes, I did change the color of the jig to match the electric chicken paddle minnow. Now, one thing that I find super interesting about this is the fact that when you have your standard bucktail jig, it is one of your fastest falling baits in your tackle box. But then you throw a plastic on it, it doesn't matter if it's a paddle tail or a straight tail plastic, this automatically turns into one of your slowest falling baits in your tackle box. So that's something that's really cool that you can play around with. Another jig that you're gonna wanna play around with as well is one of my favorites, and that is the Whistler jig. Now, as you can see, what's unique about this bait is that it has the propeller right behind its head. It spins really easy when you're dragging this thing through the water. This thing is constantly spinning, vibrating, flashing, calling fish in. It's a great river bait, of course, but don't sleep on it in lake fishing situations. Now, primarily when I'm using this bait, I'm putting a minnow on it. So now we're gonna drop this thing in the tank and we're gonna compare it to not only a fireball jig with a minnow, because like I said, I like to fish minnows on this, but also, just because you were just looking at it, we're also gonna compare it to the hair jig with the paddle tail, which had the extremely slow drop speed. So we're gonna take a look at that right now. So as you can see, the propeller on this Whistler jig spins like crazy when the bait is falling straight down on a slack line, and that slows down the drop speed a ton. So this is a really cool option if you're looking to really slow down your presentation. It's great in river fishing situations, like I said before, because the current is just constantly spinning this blade. So this is another cool one to look at. Obviously, this last clip that we watched wasn't exactly apples to apples because you had a few different size jigs. You also had the propeller, you had hair, there's a plastic on one of them, but I think you get the idea that some of these different factors really play into the drop speed of these different baits. Now, before we wrap things up, we're gonna take a few of the bait combinations that we talked about in this video, we're gonna throw them in the tank, and I'm gonna hop them across the bottom so you can see what they actually look like underwater. Here's a real quick montage, I'll start playing it right now. All right, so obviously we tried something a little bit different this time. So hopefully you enjoyed it, hopefully you learned something. If you did, make sure to hit that little red subscribe button down below because we got a lot more awesome open water videos coming up the rest of this season. So stay tuned, we got a bunch of good stuff and we'll catch you on the next video.